Heartbreak always lands hardest when it's delivered quietly, in a room full of people too polished to flinch. Spencer Lowell leaned close enough that his breath stirred the loose curl at her temple, and in a voice pitched only for her, he told Imogen Beauchamp that she looked like a sausage someone had stuffed into satin. She felt the floor tilt. What he didn't know, what no one in that gilded ballroom in downtown Toronto knew, was that the man watching from the far corner, the one nobody dared approach, had heard every word. And Dante Ferraro did not let cruelty toward the woman he'd decided was his go unanswered. By morning, Spencer's whole glittering life would be ash. He just didn't know it yet, but that came later. First, there was the cold. The snow had been falling since noon, fat, lazy flakes drifting down over Lake Ontario, softening the city into something that almost looked gentle. Imogen had watched it through the cab window on the drive over, her coat folded in her lap, her stomach already in a knot. She hadn't wanted to come. The Harbourfront Heritage Gala was the kind of event where everyone arrived already knowing everyone, where the women wore dresses that cost more than her car, where the conversation ran on a current of old money and older grudges. She had come because her firm had told her to. A senior forensic accountant did not skip the evening where half her clients drank champagne under the same chandelier. So she'd squeezed herself into the navy gown she'd had altered twice, taken the elevator up to the ballroom on the top floor of the Carrington Hotel, and walked into a sea of people built like greyhounds. Imogen was not built like a greyhound. She was tall and broad and soft, generous through the hip and full through the chest, the kind of woman department store mannequins were never modeled on. She knew the math of a room the second she entered one. She'd been doing it her whole life, and the math here was simple. She did not add up. She felt the quick flicks of glances, the way eyes touched her and slid off, the small recalculations happening behind 100 smooth foreheads. How did she get in here? She kept her chin level. She had a trick for it. She'd spent years learning to wear her body like a well-cut coat, to move through hostile rooms with the unbothered ease of someone who knew exactly what she was worth on paper. And she did know. She was, by a comfortable margin, the smartest person at most tables she sat at. She could find $500,000 hidden inside a shipping company's books the way other people found their keys. That was supposed to be enough. It was almost enough. Right up until she saw him. Spencer Lowell stood near the ice display with a flute of something pale in his hand, laughing at his own joke, golden and lean in a tuxedo that fit him like it had been grown rather than sewn. 3 years of her life. She'd given him 3 years, and an engagement ring she'd handed back in a Tim Hortons parking lot off the Gardiner, because that was where he'd chosen to end it, somewhere convenient on his way to a meeting. He'd left her for a barre instructor named Brooke, and the last thing he'd said before he drove off was that he just needed to be with someone who took care of herself. She turned for the exit. She didn't make it. Imogen. His voice arrived before he did, warm and false. He'd peeled away from a cluster of bankers and cut across the marble to intercept her, and up close he smelled exactly the same, cedar and money, and her whole body remembered it before her mind could tell it not to. I genuinely didn't think they'd let you in. I thought there was a guest list. Spencer. She kept her voice flat as a frozen pond. I'm working. He stepped sideways to block her, smiling for the benefit of anyone watching, and lowered his head so the words landed in her ear alone, soft as the snow outside. Did you actually look in a mirror before you left the house? You've gotten bigger. It's honestly a little sad. People are looking at you and feeling sorry for me that I ever proposed. The cruelty was an old one. She'd heard versions of it across 3 years, in the dark, behind closed doors, dressed up as concern, as honesty as I'm only saying this because I love you. But she had never heard it here, in the open, with the string quartet soaring away behind them, and the chandeliers throwing light over everything. It was the same poison brought out into the daylight, and somehow that made it land harder. Heat flooded her face. She didn't have a comeback. She'd built a whole career on having the answer, on staying cool while men in expensive suits tried to talk circles around her. But here, with Spencer's smug face 6 inches from hers, all of it deserted her. She simply turned and walked away as fast as the gown would let her, past a knot of laughing women who watched her go with bright, interested eyes toward the heavy double doors at the side of the ballroom that led somewhere quieter. She pushed through them, and the noise dropped away. It was the hotel's old reading room, a long, narrow space the Carrington had kept from its 1920s bones. Dark wood shelves to the ceiling, leather chairs gone soft with age, tall windows looking out over the frozen harbor. The only light came from the city beyond the glass, amber and far away. She let the door fall shut behind her and stood there shaking, both arms wrapped around her own middle, around every soft inch of herself that Spencer had just held up to the room like evidence. A sob climbed her throat before she could stop it. She let it out into the dark, certain she was alone. "That's a terrible thing to do to a face like yours," she gasped and spun toward the voice. It had come from the far end of the room, from a wing-backed chair turned half toward the cold fireplace. Low and rough and unhurried, carrying the faint music of an accent she couldn't place, somewhere south of Italy and weathered by years of somewhere else. A man unfolded from the chair and rose. He was not large the way Spencer's banker friends tried to be, all gym and posture. He was large the way certain old buildings were large, like the space had simply agreed to arrange itself around him. The city light caught the planes of his face as he stepped forward, a hard jaw shadowed with stubble, dark hair pushed back, and eyes so steady and so dark that meeting them felt like stepping off a ledge. He wore charcoal, beautifully cut, and he moved through the dim room without making a sound. "I'm sorry," Imogen said, swiping at her cheeks, mortified, certain her mascara was halfway down her face. "I didn't realize anyone was in here. I'll go." "You won't," he said it mildly, the way you might note that it was snowing. "Sit, you're upset." There was something in the voice that didn't ask, it assumed. And maybe it was the long day, or the navy gown that suddenly felt like a costume, or the simple animal relief of being spoken to without contempt. But she found herself standing still instead of leaving. "It's nothing," she managed. "Just an old wound someone decided to reopen." He took a slow step closer. People don't cry alone in dark rooms over nothing. "Who did it?" She let out a wet, bitter laugh, and the truth slid out of her before she could dress it up. "My ex. He told me I look fat in front of everyone, or close enough to everyone." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was something else, heavier. The man went very still, and his dark eyes traveled over her. Not the way Spencer's had, cataloging flaws, but slowly, deliberately, the way a person looks at a thing they've decided is worth looking at. The full sweep of her hips, the line of her waist, the soft, generous shape of her that she'd spent the evening trying to disappear inside her coat. When his gaze returned to her face, the air in the room had changed temperature. "Then your ex," he said very quietly, "is either a liar or a fool, and I have no patience for either. You are not fat, you are abundant. There is a great deal of you, and every part of it is worth more than the entire room you just walked out of." He paused. "What you are is the only thing in this hotel tonight that's actually alive." Her breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. No one had ever spoken to her like that, with that much certainty, as though he were simply reading off a fact she'd been too foolish to notice. "He didn't think so," she whispered. "He's a small man," the stranger said. "Small men can't carry anything heavier than their own vanity. Tell me his name." "Why?" "Because a man who speaks to a woman like that in a room full of people," he said, with the patience of someone explaining arithmetic to a child, "needs to be reminded how the world is actually arranged. His name." She should have lied. Some buried instinct, the same one that could smell a forged invoice from across a room, was telling her that this was not a man you handed names to lightly. But she was tired and she was raw, and the dark made it easy. "Spencer," she said. "Spencer Lowell." Something moved behind his eyes, brief and red, like a furnace door opening and shutting. "Spencer Lowell," he repeated, tasting it. "I'll remember it. And you? What do they call you?" "Imogen Beauchamp. Imogen." He said it slowly, turning it over, and on his tongue it sounded less like a name and more like a decision. He extended one large hand, the back of it scarred at the knuckle. "I'm Dante Ferraro." The name went off in her chest like a struck bell, and the warm fog of being spoken to kindly evaporated all at once. Ferraro. She knew that name the way every Torontonian who read past the front page knew it, the way you knew the name of a weather system. The Ferraros were the quiet architecture under the visible city, the family whose interests ran through the ports and the unions and the cash businesses, whose name appeared in the Star every few years attached to a body or a frozen account, and then vanished again behind a wall of lawyers. Dante Ferraro was not a wealthy man at a gala. He was the thing wealthy men at galas were afraid of, and she had just stood in a dark room and complained to him about her ex-boyfriend's manners. She took a step back. "You're that Ferraro." "I am," he said, and offered no apology for it, no softening. He simply watched her, reading her reaction the way she read a balance sheet. "I have to go." She gathered the heavy navy skirt in both fists. "I shouldn't be here. I'm sorry, He didn't grab her. His hand only closed gently around her wrist, warm and unhurried, an anchor rather than a trap. "You're not running anywhere, Imogen," he said. "Especially not from me, and certainly not from him. You're going to walk back into that ballroom, and you're going to do it with your head up, and you're going to do it on my arm." She stared at him. "Why on earth would a man like you care what some wealth manager said to me?" He held her gaze, and there wasn't a drop of pity in it. There was something older and far more dangerous, a slow, possessive fury that had already decided who it belonged to. It frightened her. It also, to her shame, sent something warm flickering down through the cold. He offered his arm. "Shall we?" For a long moment she didn't move. Then, with her knees unsteady and her heart slamming, she slid her hand into the crook of his elbow. Beneath the charcoal sleeve, the arm was solid as a railway tie. When Dante Ferraro pushed open the doors and walked back into the light of the ballroom, the change rolled through the room like a dropped temperature. It started near the doors and spread. A laugh died mid-note. A waiter froze with his tray angled, heads turned, recognized, and went carefully blank. The crowd, that smug, sleek, self-satisfied crowd that had looked at Imogen like a stain on the carpet 10 minutes earlier, drew back without seeming to decide to, opening a clear path across the marble. And along that path walked the most feared man in the city, unhurried, and on his arm, taller than she'd felt all night, walked her. She felt the stairs again, but the math of them had inverted. There was no contempt now. There was shock, and there was fear, and underneath both, there was a grudging, astonished respect. The women who'd watched her flee were studying the floor, suddenly very interested in their own shoes, and Imogen, who had spent her entire life being told to take up less space, felt herself unfold. Dante walked slowly. He was making the room read every word. His dark eyes swept the floor with the unhurried precision of a hawk over a field, and found their mark by the grand piano. Spencer stood there with a fresh drink, mid-anecdote, Brooke glittering at his elbow in something silver. Dante adjusted their course and steered Imogen straight toward them. Spencer glanced over the way you glance at an approaching nobody, and then his face simply collapsed. The color went out of it from the top down. He worked in money. He knew precisely whose money ran underneath the visible kind in this city, and he knew the face attached to it. His mouth opened and produced nothing. "Mr. Lowell," Dante said pleasantly, stopping in front of him. Mr. Ferraro." Spencer's voice cracked clean down the middle. He didn't look at Imogen at all. His whole attention was nailed to the man beside her. "I didn't know you'd be here tonight. It's a real honor." "I find these evenings educational," Dante said, his voice a low, smooth drawl, and he flicked an invisible speck from his cuff. "Take tonight. Tonight I learned that there are men in this city who think it's clever to insult a woman in front of a crowd, to call her cruel names where she can't answer. I find that very interesting, don't you?" Sweet had appeared along Spencer's hairline. I'm not sure I follow, sir." Dant turned his head, slowly, and looked down at Imogen, and the whole brutal mask of him softened into something so tender that several people nearby actually gasped. Then he looked back at Spencer, and the warmth was gone like a light switched off. "I was sitting quietly," he said, "in the reading room, and a remarkable woman came in, weeping because a coward had just told her she takes up too much room in the world." His voice dropped, gentle and terrible, forcing Spencer to lean in to catch it, drawing him into the trap. "Now, I happen to think she does not take up nearly enough." Brooke made a small, frightened sound and took a half step back, edging out of the blast radius like a woman who could feel a building about to come down. "Sir, that was a misunderstanding," Spencer stammered, his eyes finally cutting to Imogen, wide and horrified, the full arithmetic of his evening crashing in on him at once. "A joke that came out wrong. We have history, Imogen and I. You can ask her. A joke." Dante tilted his head. "I don't hear anyone laughing, Spencer. Do you?" "No, sis, no." Dante let the words sit. "Imogen is with me tonight, under my protection, and anyone who disrespects her disrespects me. You understand what that means in this city, don't you? A man in your line of work." Spencer was shaking now, openly. "Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Imogen, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean." Dante leaned in until his mouth was an inch from Spencer's ear, his voice dropping to a register only the three of them could hear. "Apologies are just weather. They pass. I prefer consequences. They last. Enjoy the rest of your evening, Mr. Lowell. Make a note of it. It's the last quiet one you'll get." He straightened, his face smoothing back into an emotionless calm, and turned to Imogen with the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. "I think we've had enough of this party. Let me take you home." She could only nod. He guided her toward the doors, leaving Spencer standing frozen and grey by the piano, and the silence held in the ballroom until the doors swung shut behind them. Outside, the cold hit her like a clean slap, and the snow was still coming down, gathering on the shoulders of the doorman on the long black SUV idling at the curb with a man in a dark coat, holding the door. The shaking caught up with her now that the adrenaline was draining off. Dante shrugged out of his suit jacket and settled it over her shoulders without asking. It was warm from his body and smelled of cedar and something sharper underneath, like the air before lightning. "You didn't have to do that," she said, watching her breath cloud. "I disagree." He stood with one hand on the open car door. "He needed to remember where he stands." "You scared him, that's enough." The dark smile came back, slow and patient, and it was somehow worse than any threat scared him. He said it almost fondly. "Imogen." That was the introduction. He looked down at her, and the city light caught the hard line of his jaw. "Spencer Lowell handles the offshore accounts for the Driscoll family. By tomorrow morning his access will be gone. By noon, the regulators will be in his lobby. By the end of the week he won't have a dollar to his name, and the men whose money he was hiding will be very interested in finding out where it went." She stared at him, her heart stalling. "You're going to take everything from him." He reached out and tucked a strand of snow-damp hair behind her ear, and his touch was startlingly gentle for a hand that scarred. "I told you I don't have patience for small men," he said. "I'm going to burn his whole world down to the studs, because no one makes my woman cry and keeps what they've got." She should have been horrified. Some part of her was. But a larger part of her, the part that had spent 3 years being told she was the problem, stood very still in the falling snow and felt something she had not let herself feel in a long time. It felt like the ground had finally decided to hold her weight. Here was the thing Spencer never understood about her, though. Imogen Beauchamp was not a woman who needed to be rescued. She had simply, for one bad night, forgotten it. She went home and she did not sleep. She sat at her kitchen table in Leslieville with a mug of tea going cold and her laptop open, and somewhere around 2 in the morning the fog of the evening burned off and the accountant came back online. The Driscoll family, offshore. Spencer. She had seen the Lowell Rise Wealth Group name cross her desk 18 months ago. A flag, a small irregularity in a client's books that traced back to a shell in the Caymans that Spencer's firm administered. She'd noted it, written it up, watched it get buried by a partner who didn't want to lose the relationship. She still had the file. She had every file. She'd never thrown a piece of paper away in her life. She didn't do it for Dante. She wanted to be honest with herself about that, sitting there in the small hours. She did it for the woman in the Tim Hortons parking lot, the one who'd handed back a ring and been told she didn't take care of herself. She pulled the old work papers and the transaction logs and the wire trails she'd flagged and been told to forget, and she built, quietly, methodically, the way she built everything. A clean, devastating, perfectly sourced map of exactly how Spencer Lowell moved the Driscolls' money. Then she encrypted it, and she sent it where it needed to go, and she went to bed and slept like a stone. Sunrise over the lake brought Spencer Lowell no mercy. He arrived at the glass tower on Bay Street at 6, his shirt already cold and damp against his back because he'd spent the whole night on the phone to contacts in the Caymans trying to move the Driscolls' hidden millions before Ferraro could freeze them. Every number had gone dead. He badged his way toward the executive elevator and the reader flashed an angry red, access denied. He slapped his palm against it, swore, and turned around to find 2 RCMP officers crossing the marble lobby toward him, a building security guard trailing behind, and through the revolving doors, 3 unmarked vans already disgorging people in windbreakers carrying empty file boxes. "Spencer Lowell," the lead officer said, holding up a thick fold of paper. "We have a production order for your office, your devices, and all firm ledgers. Your accounts are frozen pending charges, fraud, money laundering." His knees nearly went. "On what grounds?" "This is a mistake. I run legitimate portfolios." "We received a package overnight," the officer said, with the flat patience of someone who'd heard every protest there was. 10 years of transaction records. Beautifully organized, frankly. "Whoever put it together did our job for us." He nodded at the cuffs the second officer was already opening. "Turn around." As the steel closed around his wrists, Spencer's phone began to buzz in his jacket. The officer fished it out and glanced at the screen. L. Driscoll. "Want me to tell him," the officer said dryly, "that his money belongs to the Crown now?" Spencer made a sound like a man going under cold water. By noon his face was on every local channel. By 2 his lawyer had stopped returning calls. He scraped together bail from the last of the money the freeze hadn't caught, and went home to his condo in Yorkville to find Brooke wheeling 3 matched suitcases toward a waiting car. She didn't take off her sunglasses to look at him. "My card got declined at the cafe this morning, Spencer," she said. "I'm not going to be the girlfriend of a broke man the Driscolls are looking for. Don't call me." The car pulled away into the slush, and Spencer Lowell stood alone on his own front step, and the whole golden architecture of his life was simply gone. Across town, in a sunlit kitchen in Leslieville, Imogen watched the Chiron crawl across the bottom of the news. Bay Street wealth manager arrested in Driscoll laundering probe, and turned the television off, and let herself feel exactly one clean, uncomplicated breath of something she decided not to apologize for. A knock came at her door late that afternoon. There was no one in the hall when she opened it, only a long, matte black box on her mat, tied with a heavy ribbon the color of deep water. She brought it inside and untied it, and pushed back layers of dark tissue and stopped breathing. It was a dress, not a dress like the ones she owned, the ones built to compress and disguise and apologize, the ones cut to draw the eye away from her. This one had been engineered to do the opposite. It was a deep, burning crimson heavy silk that fell like poured wine, and as she lifted it from the box and held it against herself in the hall mirror saw with a strange ache that it had been cut to celebrate her, to hug the slope of her hips instead of hiding it, to honor the full line of her chest instead of binding it flat. Whoever had made it had measured a woman exactly her shape and decided she was worth the finest silk in the room. There was a card tucked into the neckline, cream cardstock, the handwriting black and slashing and sure of itself. "A woman like you was never meant to wear colors that help her disappear. Wear red tonight. My car comes at 8. D. She stood in front of the mirror for a long time. She turned, once, slowly, and looked at the woman in the glass. Not the body Spencer had narrated to her for 3 years, not the sum of all the room's quick, contemptuous calculations, but the actual woman, broad and soft and brilliant and standing up straight. She thought about every dressing room she'd ever cried in. She thought about the file she'd built at 2 a.m, clean and merciless, entirely her own work. And she lifted her chin at her reflection, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not flinch. She wore the red. The private dining room at the top of the Carrington had a wall of glass that gave onto the whole frozen city. The lake gone black beyond the harbor lights, the snow still drifting down. But when the elevator opened and Imogen stepped out, Dante Ferraro wasn't looking at the city. He stood, and for a moment the man who frightened an entire ballroom seemed to forget how to speak. The crimson silk moved with her. It clung where it was meant to cling and fell where it was meant to fall, and she had done her own hair and put on her own armor, and she walked toward him, knowing, finally, exactly how she looked. She looked like a woman who took up room. A great deal of it, and meant to. "Words generally come easily to me," Dante said, taking her hand and pressing his mouth to her knuckles. "Tonight they don't. You look like something a lesser man would start a war over." A flush climbed her throat, and this time there was nothing of shame in it. "Thank you," she said, "for the dress, and for she let the rest go unspoken. I saw the news." He drew out her chair himself. "He won't trouble you again." They ate. For a man who ran the underside of a city, Dante was an astonishment of attention. He asked about her work, her real work, the patient, brilliant grind of finding the truth hidden inside other people's numbers, and he listened to her describe a fraud she'd unwound 2 years ago with the focus of a man being told something that mattered. He never once let his eyes drift over her with anything less than open admiration. She found herself laughing. She found herself, for the length of a meal, entirely unafraid. And then the doors at the end of the room burst open. 2 men in dark coats hauled a thrashing figure across the threshold and dropped him onto the carpet. It took Imogen a second to recognize Spencer. His tuxedo from the night before was torn at the shoulder. One eye had gone purple and swollen, and there was a wildness in him now, a hunted, sweating terror. "Caught him trying to buy his way up the service elevator, boss," one of the men said. Spencer scrambled onto his knees, his head whipping between Dante and Imogen, and when his gaze landed on her, on the woman in red standing straight-backed and unbothered beside the most powerful man in the city, his mouth fell open. She did not look like the woman he had spent 3 years cutting down to size. She looked like someone who could end him with a sentence. "Imogen," he gasped, crawling a few inches forward before one of the men set a boot lightly against his shoulder and stopped him. "Imogen, please. The Driscolls are outside my building. They're going to kill me. Tell him to give the money back. Tell him to stop. You're a good person. You were always the good one. Save me." She looked down at the man on the floor, and here is what Spencer Lowell had never once in 3 years bothered to understand about her. It wasn't Dante who'd built the file. It was her. It was the careful, methodical, unbreakable mind he'd spent 3 years insulting, because it was easier than admitting he'd never once been the smartest person in their relationship. The thing that destroyed him hadn't come from the man in the charcoal suit. It had come from the woman he'd called a sausage in satin. Dante had gone very still, watching her. He didn't speak. He was, she realized, letting her have this. She crouched down, slowly, in the heavy crimson silk, so she was level with Spencer's terrified face. "You want to know the funny part, Spencer?" Her voice was perfectly calm, the voice she used to walk a room of executives through the exact moment their scheme had failed. "Mr. Ferraro froze your accounts. But the records that put you in handcuffs? The 10 years of transactions, the shell in the Caymans, the wire trail mapped out so cleanly the police said it did their job for them." She tilted her head. "I built that last night, at my kitchen table. The same brain you told me to stop using because it intimidated your friends. You didn't get taken down by a mob boss." She let the smile reach her eyes. "You got taken down by the fat woman from the parking lot." Spencer's face went the color of ash. "Save you," she said, straightening up, brushing a thread from the silk. "Save you." You stood in a room full of people and told them I should be ashamed of the body I live in. So no, Spencer. I don't think I will. Dante rose from his chair. He crossed to where Spencer knelt and stood over him, and when he spoke his voice was almost soft, which made it worse. You don't speak to her, you don't look at her, and you don't crawl across a floor begging her for mercy you spent 3 years proving you don't deserve. He glanced at his men. You had something rare in your hands and you treated it like it was nothing, because you were too small to understand what you were holding. He flicked 2 fingers toward the door. Take him down to the loading dock. The Driscoll people are waiting by the truck. Tell them his debt is theirs to collect. No, please. Imogen. Spencer's screaming filled the room as the men dragged him backward by the arms and out into the corridor, and the heavy doors swung shut and cut it off, and the dining room dropped back into its warm, lamplit quiet. Imogen stood very still. Her heart was going hard. The reality of the world she'd stepped into was dark and final and absolutely without mercy, and she did not pretend to herself that it wasn't. Dante turned to her. The cold had drained out of his eyes and left something else, banked and burning. He came to stand in front of her and lifted both hands to cradle her face, his thumbs tracing along her cheekbones. "Are you afraid of me?" he asked, low and rough. She thought about it. She thought about every dressing room mirror, every careful coat, every man who'd told her to make herself smaller to fit a world that hadn't asked her opinion. And she thought about how this man had never once, not for a single second, wanted less of her. He wanted more. He wanted her to spread out and fill the room and burn whatever needed burning. "No," she said, and laid both her hands flat against his chest. She could feel his heart under her palms, steady and certain. "I'm not afraid. I built the case that buried him with my own 2 hands. I think we both know I'm not the one anybody needs to be afraid of." Something broke open in his face, surprise, and then a kind of fierce, delighted reverence, and he laughed, low and astonished. The sound of a powerful man who had just realized the woman in front of him was more dangerous than he'd guessed, and loving every inch of it. "Imogen Beauchamp," he murmured, "where in God's name have you been?" He bent and kissed her, slow and deep, a promise with no exit clause in it, and the snow kept falling past the black glass over the sleeping city, and the woman in red, the brilliant, soft, unbreakable woman the whole gilded room had tried to make disappear, kissed the king of the city back, and did not shrink, and did not apologize, and did not ever again make herself small enough to fit inside anyone else's idea of enough.